Hello, my darlings and 411 enthusiasts. Today, I am bringing you some information from Canada, a creature of legend, and a story. The first one is a creature that is throughout the various areas of Canada. I'm going to refer to her as Dzunukwa, because I know how that one's said. Some of the others are a little more difficult to talk about. She is also known as the basket ogress, or the basket woman. She often brings wealth, is known to help out people with wealth, but she's mostly known for stealing children. She's described as towering, clumsy, wide-mouthed, hairy woman with deep-set eyes and an appetite for disobedient children. She lives with her babies in a house deep in the woods, where she hoards treasure and sleeps a lot of the time. Perhaps she's got chronic fatigue syndrome. Though she's terrifying, she's supposedly a giant, Dzunukwa can also be moved to generosity and kindness, and will even give great wealth to anyone who can make her babies cry, is what it says. But I'm stop crying, perhaps. Unlike many deities that are thought to have fled from the physical world, retreating from our possibly plane of existence, she's believed not to have fled from this physical world or realm or, universe. She's believed to still physically inhabit the dense mountainous forests. This is in the Pacific Northwest. Many people know her. She is related to, or supposedly one of, the Sasquatch, or Bigfoot. The masks that depict her, I will show a few here, show her with her lips pursed. Supposedly, she makes a hoo-hoo sound as she's going about. She's also known as Cuckoo, or Cuckoo is a relatively similar figure, also female giant that catches people and throws them into a bag over her shoulder, like human hunters would carry rabbits. Cuckoo is her Mi'kmaq name, and is believed to be derived from earthquake, since her footsteps would shake the ground. Gru is a sea monster that is a similar figure. This one's a sea monster and catches people paddling in canoes or walking along the beach. Again, with the 411, that goes with being near the water. So we have those in the forest, which is the Dzunukwa, and we have the Gru, which grabs the ones near waters. The Gru is often mistaken for a boulder until it's too late, and then you're taken. So I'm going to read you a couple of stories about the Dzunukwa, or the wild woman of the woods. A group of children knew a woman who lived all alone near the river. The children knew she was lonely, and they wanted to go visit with her. When they asked their parents for permission to go, their parents said, "No, you can't go because it's too far away. The giant woman might get you when you are away from home. The giant woman is powerful. She would put you in her large clam basket." The children ignored their parents. They got into a canoe and went on their way to visit the lonely woman. When night came, they made themselves a camp on the other side of the river. They built a fire and cooked their supper. One of the children was a hunchback. When the children divided their supper, Hunchback was given the tail part. They traveled for several days. Each evening they would stop to camp overnight and eat their supper. Every time they would give Hunchback the tail part for his share. Hunchback finally said, If you folks are always going to give me the tail part, then I would rather have the tips. I will call the giant woman." When night came and they stopped to camp and eat their supper, it was still the tail part which he was given. Now Hunchback hollered. He hollered, "Come downhill, giant woman. Come downhill, giant woman. It is just the tail part I am given by my playmates." The giant woman heard right away, "Oh, there is someone hollering at me." She put her basket on her back and she walked. She was a huge person, this giant woman. She chewed on everything as she traveled. She arrived where the children were. Right away she began to pick up the children one by one and put them in her basket. She grabbed Hunchback first and put him there. When all of the children were in the basket, the giant woman walked. She carried the children upland. Suddenly she could feel something catch in her basket. She thought, "Oh, it must be Hunchback who has caught on to something." Hunchback had squirmed and squirmed until he managed to get himself up on top of the other children. Each time he came to a leaning tree, he tried to grab hold of it. No, he couldn't do it. On the fourth try, he did it. The giant woman went on walking. When she arrived at her home with the children, she immediately gathered rocks and placed them on her fire to heat. When they were good and hot, she began to take the children out of her basket. Then she found that the Hunchback was missing. "Oh, Hunchback isn't here. Where is he? Maybe he managed to run away." The giant woman ran. Hunchback was in the canoe, shoving off from shore. He had a paddle with holes in it. This paddle had holes. Well, go figure. When Giant Woman threw rocks at him, he held up his paddle, and the rocks just went through. Hunchback paddled hard. Each time she threw a rock at him, he raised his paddle, and the rock just went through a hole. Giant Woman gave up. She went home and put more rocks on her fire. She wanted the rocks to be very hot to cook her supper fast. The children huddled together and began talking to each other. They watched the giant woman heating all of those rocks on the fire. Giant Woman noticed and said to them, "What are you saying, children?" The children carefully answered, "Oh, it's just that we are so happy for you that you are heating rocks. We would like for you to sing and dance before you cook us there." The giant woman was so flattered at the request, she said, "All right." The children said, "You will dance?" She proudly said, "Yes, I will." Now the giant woman danced. She sang this as she danced. "The children will be roasted on the rocks. The children will be roasted on the rocks. The children will be roasted on the rocks. The children will be roasted on the rocks." The children said, "Oh my, but your song is so nice. Sing more." And again the giant woman sang and danced. The oldest and strongest of the children were making plans. "We'd better push her onto the rocks." The giant woman asked, "What are you saying, children?" They cautiously answered, "Oh, we are just so happy for you." They whispered to each other, "When she comes near us, let us all push her." Oh, Giant Woman was coming closer, singing, "The children will be roasted on the rock. The children will be roasted on the rocks. The children will be roasted on the rocks." As she came close to them, all of the oldest, strongest children pushed her. Right onto the hot rocks she fell. She screamed, "Remove me, children! Remove me from the fire, and I will return you to your homes." One of the children said, "Get a forked stick, and we shall remove your grandmother from the fire. We shall remove her. Get a forked stick." However, the children took the forked stick, and everyone pressed her down onto the hot rocks until she was just stuck there, roasting. That is the end of the story. Now, I don't know about you, dear people, but that definitely smacks of The Hobbit. Tolkien studied far and wide folklore. He probably ran across this among many others that echo the story. Now, the second one, the story of the cannibal woman's sister eats her last meal, is very much similar. It has Hunchback, it has the children, it has the singing and dancing. The people came back to see that she was truly dead. At that point, I will pick up. The younger sister of the basket ogress had been hunting far away from home. Now she quietly returned. As she glanced around the area, she noticed that a big fire had died down, but there appeared to be something there covered with ashes. Then she chuckled to herself and said, "Well, well, as usual, the great, powerful one has her game cleverly hidden. This is probably the game that she has roasted and hidden here." She went closer to investigate what was covered at the fire. She knew it had been roasted. She uncovered part of it. True, it was cooked and falling apart. It was so well done. This younger sister had been out hunting and hadn't had time to stop and cook herself a good meal. She was so hungry. Now she ate. She thought that this was some game that her sister had cooked and left covered at the fire. After she'd eaten her fill, she began to feel a little sick. And she said, "Oh my goodness, this tastes like it might have been the dear one. She realized now that it was her own sister whom she had eaten, and got scared and went away from home. She walked a long way away until she came to some people in a village. She asked them, "Where is your door?" They announced, "It's through the roof that people enter who come here." They already knew, however, that Basket Ogress' sister would be traveling, and they had built a huge fire beneath the roof. When she came through the hole in the roof, they threw her into the fire, where she died. Now both monsters were dead, and that's why there are no monsters here on top, by the way the world is now. They would still be here if they hadn't been killed in the fire. The bad Basket Ogress and her younger sister. The younger sister was also bad. This story is about the way it was in the beginning. Those monsters liked to eat children. They killed them. They didn't eat old people, just the children. The daughter of the Basket Ogress, Little Tree Roots, lived. Coming generations will now be all right, because the monsters were killed. That is the end. Hey, what about that daughter? When she grows up, you kids better watch out. You see some big, ugly old lady with a basket on her back? And so it is that this was the boogeyman to keep kids from roaming far away from home and getting into trouble. I hope you found it very interesting. As was said before, she was often described as an ogress, but also related to Sasquatch, which, by the way, brings us to our second story. This is a story about Albert Ostman. This story took place in 1924. He was from Scandinavia, Albert. He was very young. He went out in search of a lost gold mine near the head of Toba Inlet in British Columbia. He had heard that there were several old mines in the area, and he wanted to see if he could locate them and, maybe get a little gold that was left behind. He took a Union steamship boat to Lund, British Columbia, where he hired an old Indian to guide him the rest of the way to the Toba Inlet. In Albert's own words, this is what he said. "This old Indian was a very talkative old gentleman. He told me stories about gold brought out by the white man from his lost mine. This white man was a very heavy drinker, spent his money freely in saloons, but he had no trouble in getting more money. He would always be away a few days and then come back with a bag of gold. But one time he went away to his mine and never came back. Some people said that a Sasquatch had killed him. At the time, I'd never heard of Sasquatch, so I asked what kind of animal he called a Sasquatch. The Indian said, they have hair all over their bodies, but they're not animals. They're people, big people living in the mountains. My uncle saw the tracks of one that were 2 feet long. One old Indian saw one over 8 feet tall. I told the Indian I didn't believe their old fables about mountain giants. It might have been some thousands of years ago, but not nowadays. The Indian said, there may not be many, but they still exist. Albert, he made it to the Toba Inlet and was happy to be camping there by himself. He figured he would scour the forest during the days looking for the mine, and at night he would map out the area he covered and make plans for the next day's exploration. He had food he'd brought from the grocer. Canned items, some bacon, beans, prunes, mac and cheese, pancake flour, just all sorts of things. He was ready to just live the high life out there. But the grocer that sold him the food also gave him some tin cans in order to keep sugar, salt, and matches dry. So, he was all ready. He had sleeping bag, a rifle, frying pan, an aluminum pot, and snuff. Because, hey, why not? Yes, I like to sneeze out carcinogenic substances. He would bundle all of this together before he set out in the morning and carried it with him as he set up new camp each night. He was very energetic because that was a lot to carry, like 80 pounds. But he didn't mind. He was on vacation. He traveled for about 3 days and decided to make a permanent camping spot out there amongst it all. Albert was sleeping in his sleeping bag when he came to a terrifying realization. He was being carried. He'd been scooped up and transported off. Obviously, what it was a lot bigger than he was. He thought he was dreaming. He had to be. But he kept getting more and more awake and was still being carried. He was wrapped up tight in a sleeping bag, and it was impossible to get out or determine who was carrying him. But he was being carried over the shoulder of something that was bipedal and amazingly strong. His first thought was that it was a snowslide. It felt like he was tossed on a horseback, but it felt like walking. He was uncomfortable and unable to move. His boots were hurting him. He was hot. There was a small opening at the top of his bag, or else he would have choked to death. He was afraid to move and was just dumbfounded. Several hours went by with this creature carrying him away from his campsite. No idea which way he's going. And then he was dropped to the ground. He could hear some kind of weird chatter, but obviously couldn't understand it as English, or I'm not sure which Scandinavian country he was from, but he did not recognize the language. He was terrified, and he was still just hoping he was having a bad dream. The next day, Albert found himself in an area that had cliffs on all sides, and he was not alone. There was with him a family of 4 Bigfoots, of Sasquatch. They were different sizes and shapes. There was an enormous creature that Albert called the Old Man, and an old lady. There were 2 younger creatures that appeared to be children. The male was over 8 feet tall and weighed about 800 pounds by Albert's figure. He judged the lady to be slightly smaller, at about 7 feet tall and probably about 600 pounds. The children were much smaller and were obviously juveniles. I had never heard of Sasquatch before the Indian told me about them, but I knew I was right among them. But how do I get away from them? That was another question. I got to see the outline of them now, and as it began to get lighter, though the sky was cloudy, it looked like rain. In fact, there was some slight sprinkle, because people in 1924 went on about minute things as they were describing things. He goes on to say, I now had circulation in my legs, but my left foot was very sore on top where it had been resting on my hobnail boots. I got my boots out from the sleeping bag and tried to stand up. I found that I was wobbly on my feet, but I had a good hold of my rifle. I asked, what do you fellows want with me? Only some more chatter. I had my compass and my prospecting glass on strings around my neck, the compass in my left-hand shirt, and my glass in my right-hand pocket. I tried to reason our location and where I was. I could see now that I was in a small valley or basin of about 8 or 10 acres, surrounded by high mountains. On the southeast side, there was a V-shaped opening of about 8 feet wide at the bottom and about 20 feet high at the highest point. This must be where I came in. But how will I get out? The old man was now sitting near this opening. I moved my belongings up close to the west wall. There were 2 small cypress trees there, and this will do for a shelter for the time being until I find out what these people want with me and how I can get away from here. I emptied out my pack sack to see what I had left in the line of food. All my canned meat and vegetables were intact, and I had 1 can of coffee, also 3 small cans of milk, 2 packages of Rye King hardtack, and my butter sealer, half full of butter. But my prunes and macaroni were missing. Also my full box of shells for my rifle. I had my sheath knife, but my prospecting pick was missing, and my can of matches. I only had my safety box full, and that only held about a dozen matches. That did not worry me. I can always start a fire with my prospecting glass when the sun is shining, if I've got dry wood. I wanted hot coffee, but I had no wood, and also nothing around here that looked like wood. I had a good look over the valley from where I was, but the boy and girl were always watching me from behind juniper bushes. I decided that there must be some water around here. The ground was leaning towards the opening in the wall. There must be water at the upper end of the valley. There is green grass and moss along the bottom. All my utensils were left behind. I opened my coffee tin and emptied the coffee into a dish towel and tied it with the metal strip from the can. I took my rifle and the can and went looking for water. Right at the head under a cliff there was a lovely spring that disappeared underground. I got a drink and a full can of water. When I got back, the young boy was looking over my belongings, but did not touch anything. On my way back, I noticed where these people were sleeping. On the east side wall of this valley was a shelf in the mountainside, with overhanging rock looking something like a big undercut in a big tree of about 10 feet deep and 30 feet wide. The floor was covered with lots of dry moss, and they had some kind of blankets woven of narrow strips of cedar bark, packed with dry moss. They looked very practical and warm with no need of washing. Now, Albert found this incredible situation he was in, but somehow he kept his bearings. The adult male was large and menacing, and Albert knew he had to keep his calm. If he didn't, he'd end up taking a severe beating from this creature, which could obviously and easily kill him. He gauged his surroundings and figured he'd bide his time to find a way to escape. The first day was pretty uneventful. They just let him do his thing. He ate food without cooking it because he still couldn't start a fire, and they were watching him, especially the 2 younger ones. He tossed over an empty can of snuff for the boy, and they played with it for a while and discovered how to open it and close it, and the boy took it to his father and showed it to him, which interested the male as well, as they had a long chatter about it. Albert realized that he only had enough food to make it out of there if he was going to make it to the Toba Inlet. He had to leave soon. Even if it meant shooting his way out. He wasn't sure which direction he'd have to travel, but he figured if he went downhill, he'd eventually find some place he was meant to be. He loaded everything up and put a shell into the rifle and started for the opening where the father sat. He stood up and pushed Albert back. It became apparent that they were going to keep him, or wanted to. Albert pointed to the opening and told the old man that he wanted to pass through. The old man kept pushing and said something that Albert would later describe as a sound like soka soka. He backed up about 50, 60 feet. If he was going to shoot his way out, then he remembered he only had 6 shells and was perfectly sure that the first one would not kill the old man. But it would make him very, very angry. And so he was thinking things over and thinking there had to be another way out without shooting his way out. So he worked on a plan B. I could make friends with the young fellow or the girl. They might help me if I could only talk to them. Then I thought of a fellow who saved himself from a mad bull by blinding him with snuff in his eyes. But how would I get near enough to this fellow to put snuff in his eyes? So I decided next time I give the young fellow my snuff box to leave a few grains of snuff in it. He might give the old man a taste of it. But the question is, in which direction will I go if I should get out? I must have been near 25 miles northeast of Toba Inlet when I was kidnapped. This fellow must have traveled at least 25 miles in 3 hours he carried me. But if he went west, we would be near salt water. Same thing if he went south. Therefore, he must have gone northeast. Then if I keep going south and over 2 mountains, I must hit salt water someplace between London and Vancouver. The following day, I did not see the old lady until 4 p.m. She came home with her arms full of grass and twigs and all kinds of spruce and hemlock. Why would you gather hemlock? That's deadly. As well as some kind of nuts that grow in the ground. I've seen a lot of them on Vancouver Island. The young fellow went up to the mountain to the east every day. He could climb better than a mountain goat. He picked some kind of grass with long, sweet roots. He gave me some one day. They tasted sweet. I gave him another snuff box with about a teaspoon of snuff in it. He tasted it, then went to the old man. He licked it with his tongue. They had a long chat. I made a dipper from a milk can. I made many dippers. You can use them for pots, too. You can cut 2 slits near the top of any can, then cut a limb from any small tree, cut down back limb, the stem of the tree, then taper the part you cut from the stem, then cut a hole in the tapered part. Okay, I don't know why we need this DIY on how to make a pot, but then I cut a hole in the tapered part, slid the tapered part into a slit you have made in the can, and you have a good handle on your can. I threw one over to the young fellow that was playing near my camp. He picked it up and looked at it, then went to his old man to show it to him. They had a long chatter. Then he came back to me, pointed at the dipper, then at his sister. I could see that he wanted one for her, too. I had another peas and carrots, so I made one for his sister. He was standing only 8 feet away from me. When I made the dipper, I dipped it in the water and drank from it. He was very pleased, almost smiling at me, then took a chew of snuff, smacked my lips, said, "That's good." The young fellow pointed to the old man and said something that sounded like, "Ook." I got the idea that the old man liked snuff, and the young fellow wanted a box for the old man. I shook my head. I motioned with my hands for the old man to come to me. I do not think the young fellow understood what he meant. He went to his sister and gave her the dipper I had made for her. They did not come near me again that day. I had now been here 6 days, but I was sure I was making progress. If only I could get the old man to come over to me, get him to eat a full box of snuff that would kill him for sure, and that way kill himself. I wouldn't be guilty of murder. Well, that's an interesting phrase. The old lady was a meek old thing. The young fellow was by this time quite friendly. The girl would not hurt anybody. Her chest was flat like a boy's. No development like young ladies. How genteelly put. I am sure if I could get the old man out of the way, I could easily have brought this girl out with me to civilization. But what good would that have been? I would have to keep her in a cage for public display. I don't think we have any right to force our way of life on other people, and I don't think they would like it. What wonderful sensibilities. The noise and racket in the modern city they would not like any more than I do. The young fellow might have been between 11 and 18 years old, and about 7 feet tall, and weigh about 300 pounds. His chest would be 50 to 55 inches, his waist about 36 to 38 inches. He had wide jaws, narrow forehead that slanted upward round the back about 4 or 5 inches higher than the forehead. The hair on the head was about 6 inches long. The hair on the rest of their body was short and thick in places. The woman's hair on the forehead had an upward turn like some women have. They call it bangs. Among women's hairdos. Nowadays, the old lady could have been anything between 40 and 70 years old. She was over 7 feet tall. She would be about 500 to 600 pounds. She had very wide hips and a goose-like walk. She was not built for beauty or speed. Some of those lovable brassiers and uplifters would have been a great improvement on her looks and her figure. The man's eye teeth were longer than the rest of the teeth, but not long enough to be called tusks. The old man must have been near 8 feet tall, big-barreled chest and big hump on his back, powerful shoulders. His biceps on upper arm were enormous and tapered down to his elbow. His forearms were longer than common people have, but well proportioned. His hands were wide. The palm was long and broad and hollow like a scoop. His fingers were short in proportion to the rest of his hands. His fingernails were like chisels. The only place they had no hair was inside their hands and the soles of their feet, and the upper part of the nose and eyelids. I never did see their ears. They were covered with hair hanging over them. If the old man were to wear a collar, it would have been at least 30 inches. I have no idea what size shoes they would need. I was watching the young fellow's foot one day when he was sitting down. The soles of his feet seemed to be padded like a dog's foot, and the big toe was longer than the rest and very strong. In mountain climbing, all he needed was footing for his big toe. They were very agile. To sit down, they turned their knees out and came straight down. To rise, they came straight up without the help of hands or arms. I don't think this valley was their permanent home. I think they moved from place to place as food is available in different locations. They might eat meat, but I have never seen them eat meat, nor do any cook. I think this was probably a stopover place, and the plants with sweet roots on the mountainside might have been in season this time of year. They seem to be most interested in them. The roots have a very sweet and satisfying taste. They always seem to do everything for a reason. Wasted no time on anything they did not need. When they were not looking for food, the old man and the old lady were resting, but the boy and girl were always climbing for something or some other exercise. A favorite position was to take hold of his feet with his hands and balance on his rump, then bounce forward. The idea seemed to be how far he could go without his feet or hands touching the ground. Sometimes he made 20 feet. That's quite interesting. Albert couldn't stop wondering what they wanted from him. Was he a pet? Was he livestock? Well, that's a worrying situation. He didn't feel threatened, but he wondered how this was going to end, particularly if they were migratory. He couldn't stay there indefinitely. The old man was coming closer and closer to Albert each day. He seemed interested in Albert's can of snuff. One morning after breakfast, the old man and the boy came over and sat just 10 feet from Albert. He was making a pot of coffee with shag and branches for kindling, and with a match he ignited the labels from his can to start the fire. The coffee was brewing very strong, and once it started boiling, it put off a nice fog of aroma. Albert sat there eating hardtack, which was slathered with butter, and sipping his coffee and watching his rations decrease. And they continued to watch him. He made a big show of enjoying his food and smacking his lips. Oh, he wanted them to think it was so delicious. He rubbed his belly and, just really put on a show for him. As he put the coffee down and pulled out the mysterious can of snuff, he took a small pinch. He only had 2 cans left, and before he could close the lid, the old man reached out for it. Not wanting to waste it, he held it out to him, allowing for him to take a pinch instead of the old man grabbing the entire can and pouring it into his mouth. Then with his tongue, he licked the inside of the tin. Now, that doesn't make sense because he wanted him to eat it. After a few minutes, his eyes began to roll over in his head, and he was looking straight up. Boy, this sounds like quite the tale. I could see that he was sick. Then he grabbed my coffee can that was quite cold by the time. He emptied that in his mouth, grounds and all. That did no good. He stuck his head between his legs and rolled forward a few times away from me. Then he began to squeal like a stuck pig. I grabbed my rifle and said to myself, "This is it. If he comes for me, I will shoot him plumb between his eyes." But he started for the spring. He wanted water. I packed my sleeping bag and my pack sack with the few cans I had left. The young fellow ran over to his mother. Then she began to squeal. I started for the opening in the wall, and I just made it. The old lady was right behind me. I fired 1 shot at the rock over her head. I guess she had never seen a rifle before. She turned and ran inside the wall. I injected another shell into the barrel of my rifle and started downhill, looking back over my shoulder every so often to see if they were coming. I was in a canyon, and good traveling, and I made fast time. Must have been 3 miles in some world record time. I came to a turn in the canyon, and I had the sun on my left. That meant I was going south, and the canyon turned west. I decided to climb the ridge ahead of me. I knew that I must have 2 mountain ridges between me and salt water, and by climbing this ridge I'd have a good view of this canyon so I could see if the Sasquatch was coming after me. I had a light pack and was making good time up the hill. I stopped soon after looking back to where I came from, but nobody followed me. As I came over the ridge, I could see Mount Baker. Then I knew I was going in the right direction. I was hungry and tired. I opened my pack sack to see what I had to eat. I decided to rest here for a while. I had a good view of the mountainside, and if the old man was coming, I had the advantage because I was up above him. To get me, he would have to come up a steep hill, and that might not be so easy after stopping a few 30-30 bullets. I had made up my mind that this was my last chance, and that I would be a fight to the finish. I rested here for 2 hours. It was 3 p.m. when I started down the mountainside. It was nice going, not too steep, and not too much underbrush. When I got near the bottom, I shot a big blue grouse. She was sitting on a windfall, looking right at me, only 100 feet away. I shot her neck right off. I made it down the creek at the bottom of this canyon. I felt safe now. I made a fire between 2 big boulders, roasted the grouse. The next morning when I woke up, I was feeling terrible. My feet were sore from dirty socks. My legs were sore. My stomach was upset from that grouse that I ate the night before. I was not too sure I was going to make it up that mountain. I finally made the top, but it took me 6 hours to get there. It was cloudy, visibility about a mile. I knew I had to go downhill. After about 2 hours, I got down to the heavy timber and sat down to rest. I could hear a motor running hard at times, then stopped. I listened to this for a while and decided the sound was from a gas donkey. Someone was logging in the neighborhood. I told them I was a prospector and lost. I did not like to tell them that I had been kidnapped by Sasquatch. If I'd told them that, they probably would have said he's crazy too. The following day I went down from this camp on Salmon Arm Branch of Setchelt Inlet. from there, I got the Union boat back to Vancouver. That was my last prospecting trip and my only experience with what is known as Sasquatches. Now, in another page that I looked at about this, it talks about details that Ostman came up with that kind of check out, though he should not have known about at the time. Don Hunter wrote that Austin made particular reference to the size of old male Sasquatch's penis. He indicated that the head was hooded with skin and in this respect resembled that of a stallion, but only in this respect. He seemed puzzled by the fact that the old man's was only about 2 inches long. Now, if Ostman had been fantasizing about the Sasquatch family, it would have seemed logical that he would have over-endowed the male with much more impressive equipment to match its giant stature. And the instance becomes interesting when we notice that gorillas, the biggest primates of all, have a penis of about 2 inches. And I don't believe I think gorillas were still cryptids at the point that he had this encounter. He said it was like an inverted funnel, which sounds horse-like. It's hard to see how Mr. Ostman, whose story was one of the very earliest, could have known so much without having had an opportunity for close observation of all individuals he described. So that's probably a detail you might not have wanted to know, but an interesting one nonetheless. I guess all those poor women kidnapped by Sasquatch in the old Weekly World News were not very lucky. Well, that is a very well-known story. It was in the papers. He was interviewed many times during his entire life about the thing. I don't know if it was an old man's story. I don't know if it was true. That I leave up to you, dear listener, to determine. This video takes a few aspects of the missing 411 and stories and lore that kind of match up. So take from it what you will, and I hope you enjoyed it. A very interesting story of old Albert, but believe me, I know old Scandinavian men are very good, very, very good at stories. Thank you for visiting, and special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and of course Charlotte Emerson.